Stay down! Don't move off! I said don't move!
12 years, 3 deployments, 2 commendations signed by the Secretary of Defense. Darius Okafor had operated in places most Americans will never find on a map. He had cleared rooms in the dark, in body armor, against men who were actively trying to kill him. He had survived things that would permanently break most people, and he came home every single time. But on a Wednesday afternoon, in broad daylight, outside a federal building in his own city, 3 local police officers decided he didn't belong there. No warrant, no crime, no probable cause. Just a black man in a gray t-shirt and jeans sitting on stone steps, and one officer who had already written the story in his head before he ever opened his mouth. What happened next took 11 minutes. The fallout lasted less than 24 hours. And when it was over, 6 careers were gone. Not suspended, not investigated, gone, overnight. Stay with this story, because what happened in the next 24 hours changed 6 lives forever. And if you appreciate stories where arrogance collapses under its own weight, subscribe. There's more like this coming. Wednesday, 1:51 p.m. The spring sun was doing that thing where it turns concrete warm enough to feel through denim. Darius Okafor sat on the 3rd step from the bottom of the Hargrove Federal Building entrance, checking his watch for the 2nd time in 3 minutes. His gray t-shirt had a small coffee stain near the collar from breakfast, the kind of detail you don't notice until you're sitting still with nothing to do but wait. His jeans were broken in. His boots were civilian. No tactical tread, no military issue, just standard leather work boots he'd owned for 4 years. Around his neck, a single dog tag hung on a ball chain, resting just below his collarbone. He wasn't hiding it. He just wasn't broadcasting it either. The meeting was set for 2 o'clock, 9th floor, Office 914. A naval intelligence liaison named Everett Cross, who Darius had never met in person, but had traded approximately 47 emails with over the past 6 weeks regarding a consulting contract that was above Darius's current pay grade and below his security clearance. The kind of meeting where you show up in civilian clothes because the last thing naval intelligence wants is a man in uniform walking through a federal building lobby carrying a briefcase full of operational assessments. Low profile, low visibility, in and out. Darius had arrived 11 minutes early because that's what 12 years of military discipline does to a man's sense of punctuality. He could have waited in the lobby. He chose the steps. Fresh air, no fluorescent lights. A chance to decompress before walking into a room where every word he said would be logged. Recorded and filed into a classification tier he wasn't allowed to discuss with his own family. He didn't look out of place. He looked like a man waiting for an appointment, which is exactly what he was. But that's not what Officer Vince Drayton saw when he rolled past in his patrol car at 1:53 p.m. Vince had been working this district for 9 years. The Hargrove Federal Building sat at the edge of what the department called the Graymont Corridor, a 12-block radius of office buildings, upscale condos, and the kind of restaurants where lunch costs more than most people's car payment. It was a good area, low crime, high property values, the kind of place where patrol meant visibility, not enforcement. Most days, Vince's job was to be seen. To remind the people who lived and worked in Graymont that the city cared about their safety enough to keep a uniform on their streets. Most days, Vince liked that job. It was easy, it was predictable, and it came with the unspoken understanding that the people in this part of the city didn't cause problems, which meant Vince didn't have to solve them. But every so often, not often, but often enough that Vince had developed a kind of reflex for it. Something didn't fit. A variable. A deviation from the pattern Vince had built in his head over 9 years of driving the same 12 blocks 5 days a week. And when Vince saw a variable, he did what he'd been trained to do. He addressed it. At 1:53 p.m., Vince Drayton saw a black man in a gray t-shirt and jeans sitting on the steps of a federal building with no briefcase, no badge lanyard, no suit jacket, and no visible reason to be there. The man was just sitting, hands on his knees, looking at his phone, doing nothing. And that nothing, that absence of obvious purpose, was enough. Vince didn't run a plate because there was no car to run. He didn't call it in because there was nothing to report. He didn't pull up dispatch records or check for outstanding warrants or review federal building visitor logs. He just pulled his cruiser to the curb 30 feet from where Darius was sitting, killed the engine, and stepped out. Vince adjusted his belt the way cops do when they want you to notice the gun, the cuffs, the radio, the baton, all the tools hanging off a leather strap that turns a man into a walking reminder of authority. He walked across the sidewalk with the posture of someone who had already decided this conversation was going to go one way, his way. He didn't see a 12-year veteran. He didn't see a man with 3 combat deployments and 2 commendations from the Secretary of Defense. He didn't see someone waiting for a classified intelligence briefing in an office 300 feet above his head. He saw a black man sitting somewhere Vince had decided he didn't belong. And in Vince Drayton's mind, that was all the probable cause he needed, even though it wasn't probable cause at all. Darius looked up from his phone. He saw the uniform first, then the walk, then the expression, and in the span of about 2 seconds, Darius Okafor, who had spent 12 years reading body language in some of the most dangerous places on the planet, understood exactly what kind of conversation this was about to be. He slid his phone into his pocket. He kept his hands visible, and he waited. Vince stopped 3 feet from the bottom step, close enough to establish presence, far enough to keep tactical distance. His hand rested on his belt, fingers drumming against the leather just above his radio. He didn't say hello. He didn't introduce himself. He led with authority the way some people lead with a handshake. "What are you doing here?" Darius didn't move. His hands stayed on his knees. His voice came out level, measured, the tone of a man who had de-escalated more volatile situations than this in places where the stakes were bullets instead of badges. "I have a meeting, 2 o'clock, 9th floor. "With who?" "Naval Intelligence Liaison. His name is Everett Cross. Office 914. I can call him if you need verification." Darius said it the way you'd give directions to someone who asked. No edge, no attitude, just information. The kind of compliance that should have ended the conversation before it became one. He reached slowly, telegraphing the movement, keeping his other hand visible, toward his front pocket where his phone was. "Don't move." Vince's voice cut through the air like a door slamming. His hand dropped from his belt to his radio. Not the gun, not yet. But the shift in posture said everything. The conversation had just stopped being a conversation. Darius froze, hand halfway to his pocket. He could see it playing out already, the reach interpreted as a threat, the phone mistaken for something else, the entire encounter turning into a headline in the time it took Vince to make the wrong assumption. So Darius did what 12 years of survival instinct had taught him to do. He pulled his hand back, slowly, visibly, and he placed both palms flat on his knees. "I'm just reaching for my phone. I can call my contact. He's upstairs. He can verify I'm supposed to be here." "Stay where you are." Vince keyed his radio. 2 clicks. Then his voice, clipped and certain, like a man calling in something he'd already decided was a problem. "Unit 47 to dispatch. I need a unit at the Hargrove Federal Building. Front steps. Possible trespassing." Possible trespassing. Darius heard it and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, something closer to resignation. He'd done everything right, identified himself, explained his presence, offered verification, and Vince Drayton had heard none of it. Or worse, he'd heard all of it and decided it didn't matter. 4 minutes later, 2 more patrol cars pulled up. Saying Officers Cody Fisk and Paul Rettner stepped out almost simultaneously, like they'd rehearsed it. Fisk was younger, maybe late 20s, still new enough to the job that his uniform looked like it had been ironed that morning. Rettner was older, heavier, with the kind of walk that said he'd been doing this long enough to stop caring how it looked. They both approached Vince first, a quick exchange. Vince gestured toward Darius. Rettner nodded. Fisk glanced over, then looked away. Now there were 3 of them, 3 uniforms standing in a loose semicircle at the base of the steps, and Darius, still sitting, still calm, still holding his hands exactly where they'd been for the last 6 minutes. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stand up and put your hands behind your back." It was Vince who said it, not a question, not a request. Say, a command delivered with the certainty of a man who had already written the rest of this scene in his head and was now just waiting for Darius to follow the script. Darius didn't argue. He stood, slowly, hands rising with him, palms still open, still visible. The dog tag around his neck swung forward as he shifted his weight, catching a sliver of afternoon sunlight. It hung there, 6 inches from Vince Drayton's face, stamped metal on a ball chain, reflecting light like a signal flare nobody bothered to read. Vince didn't look at it. His eyes were locked on Darius's hands. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Officer, I can explain. Turn around. Darius turned. He felt Rettner step closer on his left, Fisk on his right. He heard the metallic click of handcuffs being pulled from a belt. Man, he understood, with the clarity that only comes when you've run out of options, that this was no longer about explanation. It wasn't about verification. It wasn't about the meeting upstairs or the man in office, 914, who was going to check his watch in exactly 4 minutes and wonder where the hell Darius Okafor was. This was about 3 officers who had decided what this was before Darius ever opened his mouth. And now they were just going through the motions of making it official. Vince stepped forward. His hand went to Darius's wrist. The cuffs came out, and the dog tag, still hanging there, still catching the light, still 6 inches from Vince Drayton's face, swung gently against Darius's chest. Vince never looked down. The cuffs went on. Steel closed around Darius's wrists with that distinct double-click sound that means the ratchet's locked and your hands belong to someone else now. Vince pulled them tight, not tight enough to cut circulation, but tight enough to make a point. Darius didn't flinch. He'd been in worse restraints in worse places. He kept his breathing steady and waited for whatever instruction came next. What came next was Rettner's voice from somewhere behind his left shoulder. Get him on the ground. Darius turned his head slightly, confused, compliant, trying to understand what ground had to do with a man who was already cuffed, already standing exactly where he'd been told to stand, already doing everything 3 armed officers had asked him to do. I'm cooperating. I haven't... On the ground. Now. It was Vince who said it, and the tone had shifted. No longer procedural, no longer detached. There was heat in it now, frustration. The edge of a man who had expected resistance and wasn't getting it, and somehow that made it worse. Darius opened his mouth to respond, to ask what he'd done, to clarify what instruction he'd missed. But Vince Drayton didn't wait for clarification. He put his hand on Darius's shoulder and pushed. Not guided, pushed. Darius's center of gravity shifted. His hands were locked behind him so he couldn't catch himself. He tried to drop to his knees in a controlled descent, the way you'd go down if you had time and training and some measure of control over your own body. But Vince's hand was still on him, pressing down, and the angle was all wrong. Darius went sideways. His shoulder hit the concrete step first, then his ribs. Ding, and then his face. The impact rattled through his skull like something had come loose inside. He tasted copper, blood from somewhere, his lip maybe, or the inside of his cheek where his teeth had caught tissue. The concrete was warm under his face. He could feel the texture of it, rough, pitted, the kind of surface that takes skin off if you slide across it wrong. Vince dropped a knee onto his back, right between the shoulder blades. The air left Darius's lungs in a sharp gasp. His ribs compressed under the weight of a man who had decided that this needed to look like resistance even if it wasn't. Stop resisting. Vince said it loud. Loud enough for the people walking past on the sidewalk. Loud enough for the woman in business attire 40 feet away who had her phone out and pointed at them. Though loud enough for the man across the street who had stopped mid-stride to watch what was happening on the steps of a federal building in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon. Darius hadn't moved. His hands were cuffed behind his back. His face was pressed against concrete. He wasn't resisting. He was barely breathing. I'm not... Darius started, but Vince's knee shifted, pressing harder, and the words died in his throat. Fisk stood 3 feet away, hands on his belt, watching. His face was unreadable, not approving, not disapproving, just watching. The kind of passive witness who tells himself later that he wasn't involved because he didn't put his hands on anyone. Rettner circled around to Darius's other side, pulling out his notebook, already writing the narrative that would turn this into something defensible on paper. Across the plaza, 4 different people were filming, 4 different angles, 4 different phones pointed at the same scene, recording the same truth that would later contradict every word Paul Rettner was about to write. Inside the Hargrove Federal Building, 9th floor, Office 914, Everett Cross checked his watch. 2:03 p.m. He frowned, looked at his phone. No missed calls, no messages. Darius Okafor had confirmed the meeting twice. Once Monday, once this morning. Cross had cleared his afternoon, pulled the files, prepped the briefing. He walked to the window and looked down at the plaza below. From 9 floors up, he couldn't see faces. Just shapes, movement. 3 police officers standing near the steps, a small crowd forming. He stared for a moment, then turned back to his desk and picked up his phone. Down on the concrete, Darius Okafor lay still. Darts, he had cleared rooms in Fallujah with nothing but a rifle and 4 other men who trusted him with their lives. He had operated in 3 other countries most civilians couldn't find on a map. He had been shot at, hunted, surrounded, and left in situations where the wrong move meant you didn't come home. He knew how to fight. He knew how to resist. He knew exactly how much damage he could do to Vince Drayton in the 3 seconds it would take Fisk and Rettner to react. But he also knew something Vince didn't. Surviving the next 5 minutes and winning the war that came after were 2 completely different things. And Darius Okafor had spent 12 years learning how to win wars. So he didn't fight back. He didn't resist. He lay there with Vince's knee on his spine and concrete under his cheek, and 4 cameras recording every second of it. And he waited. The 3rd precinct booking desk smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that makes every wall look the same. Darius sat in a plastic chair bolted to the floor, wrists still cuffed behind him, waiting while Vince Drayton filled out paperwork at a counter 15 feet away. His lip had stopped bleeding. The scrape on his cheekbone had started to swell. His ribs ached with every breath. Not broken, he didn't think, but bruised deep enough that he'd feel it for a week. He said nothing. He'd stopped talking the moment they put him in the back of the patrol car. There was no point. Every word he'd said on those steps had been ignored, every explanation dismissed, every offer of verification treated like a stalling tactic. So Darius had made a decision that 12 years of military operations had drilled into him. When the situation's already gone wrong, stop giving people ammunition. Shut up, observe, document everything. And he was documenting. Badge numbers, names, timestamps. The route they took from the federal building to the precinct. The fact that Vince hadn't read him his rights until they were already 2 blocks away. The fact that Fisk sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window the entire ride, saying nothing, doing nothing, his silence as loud as a confession. Officer Linda Navarro ran the booking. She was in her 40s, with the kind of efficient disinterest that comes from processing 1,000 people who all claim they didn't do anything wrong. She took Darius's personal effects without comment. Wallet, phone, keys, watch. And the dog tag. She held it for a second, read it. Her eyes flicked to Darius's face, then back to the tag. She typed something into the computer. Then she dropped the tag into a clear plastic evidence bag, sealed it, and wrote on the label, "Personal property, military dog tag, U.S. Navy." She slid the intake form across the counter to the man standing behind her. Sergeant Roy Kettner, 22 years on the force, broad shoulders, gray at the temples, the kind of supervisor who signed off on 50 arrest reports a week and remembered maybe 3 of them. Kettner picked up the form. His eyes moved down the page. Name, date of birth, arresting officer, charges, criminal trespassing, resisting arrest. His gaze stopped on the personal property line. He read the notation, military dog tag, U.S. Navy. He looked at the bag sitting on the counter next to the form. Then he looked at Vince Drayton, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, waiting. Kettner's pen hovered over the signature line for maybe 2 seconds, long enough to matter. Long enough that if he'd asked even one question, military, Navy, was he in uniform? Did you verify? The entire trajectory of the next 24 hours would have changed. He didn't ask. He signed. The pen scratched across the bottom of the page. Approval granted. Charges filed. Case logged into the system as just another Wednesday arrest in a precinct that processed 30 of them a week. Across the room, Paul Rettner sat at a desk with a keyboard and a blank incident report template on the screen in front of him. He typed slowly, methodically, or it's the way a man types when he's choosing his words carefully because he knows those words are going to be read by people who weren't there. Subject was observed loitering outside the Hargrove Federal Building with no apparent legitimate purpose. When approached by officers, subject became verbally aggressive and refused to comply with lawful commands. Subject made furtive movements toward his waistband, Officers perceived an immediate threat. Subject was taken into custody after resisting physical restraint. Every sentence was a lie, or close enough to a lie that it didn't matter. Darius hadn't been loitering. He'd been waiting for a scheduled meeting. He hadn't been verbally aggressive. He'd been calm to the point of robotic. He hadn't made furtive movements. He'd tried to reach for his phone to verify his story. Though he hadn't resisted physical restraint, he'd been slammed face first into concrete while cuffed and compliant. But Paul Rettner wasn't writing what happened. He was writing what needed to have happened for 3 officers to justify putting a man on the ground in front of 4 cameras. And in Paul Rettner's 9 years of experience, the report was always more important than the truth. The report was what got read in court. The report was what supervisors reviewed. The report was the story. And nobody had found those 4 videos yet. Rettner hit save, logged the report, sent it up the chain. Done. 2 hours later, they gave Darius his phone call. Standard procedure, 1 call, local. The booking officer slid a desk phone across the counter and told him he had 5 minutes. Most people call a lawyer or family. Then someone who can post bail or start making calls to get them out. Darius dialed a number with a Virginia area code. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered, clipped, professional. Naval Legal Command, Commander Solerin. Darius kept his voice level, calm, the same tone he'd used on the steps, in the car, at the booking desk. The tone of a man who wasn't panicking, because panic was a waste of energy. Commander, this is Petty Officer First Class Darius Okafor, service number 7718-4392. I need to report an incident. There was a pause, then the sound of a chair moving, papers shifting, the ambient noise of an office suddenly going quiet. Go ahead, Okafor. I was arrested 2 hours ago outside the Hargrove Federal Building. I was there for a classified liaison meeting with Naval Intelligence Officer Everett Cross, Office 914. Was scheduled for 1,400 hours. I was detained by local police, charged with trespassing and resisting arrest. I am currently being held at the 3rd Precinct. The charges are false. I have witnesses. And I need you to document this before anything else happens. He said it the way he'd brief a mission debrief. Facts, chronology, no emotion, just data. On the other end of the line, Commander Nkechi Solerin was already opening a new file on her computer. Understood. Stay on the line. I'm going to need details. And Okafor? Yes, ma'am. Don't say anything else to anyone until I call you back. Darius almost smiled. Almost. Yes, ma'am. Commander Nkechi Solerin had been practicing military law for 16 years. She had handled everything from minor misconduct to full-scale courts-martial. She had reviewed cases that ended careers and cases that ended in acquittals that should have been convictions. She had learned a long time ago that the military justice system worked best when you treated it like a machine. Methodical, procedural, unemotional. You fed it the right documentation in the right order, and it produced the right result. Every time. At 4:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, she sat at her desk in the Naval Legal Command office in Virginia, staring at a computer screen that displayed 47 pages of documentation she had compiled in the last 2 hours. Service record, deployment history, commendations, security clearance. Just the classified meeting confirmation from Naval Intelligence Officer Everett Cross. Timestamps showing Darius Okafor's exact location, exact purpose, exact authorization to be sitting on those steps at that exact time. And then the arrest report. Criminal trespassing, resisting arrest, filed by Officer Paul Rettner, approved by Sergeant Roy Kettner, logged into a municipal database as case number 2025-04-8841. She read it 3 times. Not because it was complicated, because it was so obviously, demonstrably false that she needed to make sure she wasn't missing something. She wasn't. The timeline alone was enough to dismantle it. Darius had been arrested at 2:03 p.m., 3 minutes after his scheduled meeting time. The meeting that was documented, confirmed, and sitting in a federal building file with a classification stamp on it. And Commander Solerin picked up her phone. She didn't call the 3rd Precinct. She didn't call the arresting officer. She didn't call a local attorney or a city ombudsman or anyone whose job it was to handle complaints through normal municipal channels. She called the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Direct line. The kind of number you only have if you've worked federal cases long enough to know who handles what. A man answered on the second ring. Civil Rights Division, Agent Howell. Agent Howell, this is Commander Nkechi Solarin, Naval Legal Service Command. I'm filing a formal complaint regarding the unlawful detention of an active-duty Navy service member by local law enforcement. I'm sending you the full case file now, 47 pages. I need this logged, time-stamped, and escalated immediately. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't explain the outrage or the injustice or how wrong this was. She just stated facts. Military personnel, unlawful detention, federal jurisdiction. The kind of language that turns a local arrest into a federal case file before anyone at the local level knows it's happening. Understood, Commander. Send it through. She hit send. The file uploaded in 14 seconds. On the other end, Agent Howell opened it, scanned the first 3 pages, and forwarded it to his supervisor with a priority flag before Commander Solarin had even hung up the phone. At 5:03 p.m., 16 minutes after Commander Solarin made that call, the 3rd Precinct's Internal Affairs Office received a notification through the departmental complaint system. It was an automated forward. The kind of thing that happens when someone files a grievance online or calls the civilian oversight hotline. Internal Affairs Officer Conrad Speer saw the notification pop up on his screen while he was finishing his second cup of coffee and wondering whether he had time to leave early. He clicked it open, read the header, military complaint, Navy service member, arrest incident, April 17th. He sighed. This was going to take longer than he wanted. Speer pulled the case file. Read Retner's report. Trespassing. Resisting arrest. Officer perceived a threat. Subject taken into custody. Standard language. The kind of report Speer had reviewed 1,000 times. He cross-referenced it with Kettner's approval signature. Everything was in order. Proper chain of command. Proper documentation. Then he read the complaint, where subject claims he was authorized to be at the location. Subject claims he had a scheduled meeting. Subject claims the arrest was unlawful. Speer had read those claims before too. Everyone claimed something. Everyone had a story. The question wasn't whether they claimed it. The question was whether the documentation supported it. He looked at what the complainant had attached, a service record, some emails, a reference to a meeting that supposedly happened. Nothing concrete. Nothing that contradicted the officer's report in any way that mattered. Speer had been doing this job for 11 years. He knew how these things went. Officers made judgment calls. Sometimes civilians didn't like those calls. That didn't make them wrong. He typed his findings into the response field. Complaint reviewed. On an arrest conducted in accordance with departmental policy. Officer's assessment of probable cause supported by observed behavior. Insufficient evidence to substantiate claim of wrongful detention. He marked the case closed, filed it into the archive folder. Checked the time, 5:52 p.m. Close enough. Conrad Speer finished his coffee, shut down his computer, and left the office thinking he'd just handled a routine complaint the way he handled 50 others every month. Quick review. No findings. Case closed. He had no idea that the complaint he'd just buried had already been forwarded to a federal agency 3 hours earlier with a classification tag and a priority flag. He had no idea that while he was typing insufficient evidence into a municipal database, the Agent Howell at the DOJ was forwarding that same 47-page file to a federal prosecutor who specialized in civil rights violations. He had no idea that Commander Nkechi Solarin hadn't filed the complaint with Internal Affairs first. She'd filed it with the DOJ first. The Internal Affairs notification was just a courtesy copy, a procedural formality that let the local department know the federal government was already involved. Conrad Speer thought he was ahead of this, thought he'd contained it, thought marking it insufficient evidence, and closing the file meant the problem was gone. But the cover-up was already 3 moves behind before it even started. By the time Conrad Speer walked out of the 3rd Precinct at 6:04 p.m., the DOJ had already opened an official case file, assigned an investigator, and requested the body cam footage from every officer involved in the arrest. And nobody in that building knew it yet. The press conference was scheduled for 10 o'clock, prime time, late enough that the local news cycle could pick it up live, early enough that the morning papers could run it above the fold. Chief Gordon Hale had done this before, dozens of times. A controversial arrest, public outcry, media pressure. The playbook was simple. You get in front of the cameras before the story gets ahead of you. You project confidence. You remind people that officers make split-second decisions in unpredictable situations. You express commitment to transparency while simultaneously asserting that the department followed protocol. You make it clear that you stand behind your people, and then you let the news cycle move on to something else. The podium was set up in the press room on the second floor of City Hall. 6 microphones, cluster of cameras. We 23 reporters crammed into folding chairs, some of them already typing on laptops, prepping the story before Hale even opened his mouth. Behind him, the city seal, navy blue background, gold lettering. The visual said authority, stability, institution. Hale stepped to the podium at 10:04 p.m. He wore his dress uniform, pressed, medals visible. The kind of presentation that reminded people he'd been doing this job for 28 years and had seen more than any reporter in that room ever would. He didn't look nervous. He looked composed, authoritative, completely certain. He opened with a prepared statement, read it from a single sheet of paper he didn't really need because he'd already memorized it. Earlier today, which officers from the 3rd Precinct responded to a report of suspicious activity outside the Hargrove Federal Building. The individual in question was detained after failing to comply with lawful commands from responding officers. During the course of the detention, the individual resisted, and officers used appropriate force to secure the scene and ensure public safety. He paused, looked up from the paper, made eye contact with the cameras. I want to be very clear. The officers involved acted appropriately, professionally, and in full accordance with departmental guidelines. They responded to a situation that required intervention. They followed protocol, and we stand behind them completely. A reporter in the 3rd row raised her hand. Chief, there are reports that the man arrested was a military veteran. Can you confirm? Hale didn't flinch. I'm not going to comment on the specifics of an ongoing case. What I will say is that every individual, regardless of background, is subject to the same laws and the same expectations of compliance with lawful police commands. Another reporter. Were the officers aware of his military status at the time of the arrest? Again, I'm not going to speculate on what the officers knew or didn't know in the moment. What matters is that they responded to a situation, assessed a potential threat, and acted accordingly. It went on like that for 11 minutes. Confident answers, controlled tone, no admissions, no apologies, no cracks in the institutional armor. By the time Hale stepped away from the podium at 10:17 p.m., he believed he'd done exactly what he needed to do. He'd framed the narrative. He'd defended his officers. He'd reminded the public that police work is difficult and that second-guessing from a distance is easy. He had no idea what was about to happen. At 1:09 a.m., a woman named Jessica Ortiz, who had been walking past the Hargrove Federal Building on her lunch break 7 hours earlier and had filmed the entire takedown on her phone, uploaded the video to social media. She'd spent the evening debating whether to post it, wondering if it mattered, wondering if anyone would care. Then she'd watched Chief Hale's press conference on the news, watched him say the officers acted appropriately, watched him say the individual resisted, and she'd decided the world needed to see what she saw. The video was 2 minutes and 43 seconds long, unedited, filmed from across the plaza. So it showed 3 officers surrounding a man on the steps. It showed the man with his hands visible, calm, not moving aggressively. It showed him being forced to the ground. It showed the knee on his back. It showed him not resisting. It showed everything Paul Rettner's report said didn't happen. The video had 15,000 views by 1:45 a.m., 100,000 by 2:30. By 3 a.m., it was trending on 3 platforms. By 4 a.m., it had been picked up by a national news aggregator. By 6 a.m., every major network was running it. And by 7 a.m., 9 hours after Gordon Hale stepped away from that podium, the press conference and the bystander footage were playing side by side on screens across the country. Split screen, left side, Chief Gordon Hale in his dress uniform. The officers involved acted appropriately, professionally, and in full accordance with departmental guidelines. Right side, Darius Okafor face down on concrete, hands cuffed, not resisting, knee on his back, 4 cameras recording. It wasn't just one video. By morning, all 4 angles had surfaced. Different perspectives, same story. A man complying, officers escalating, a takedown that never needed to happen. And Gordon Hale's voice, over and over, on a loop. We stand behind them completely. He thought he was doing damage control. He thought he was defending his department. He thought standing firm in front of the cameras would project strength and reassure the public that the system worked. What he actually did was create a time-stamped, publicly broadcast statement that contradicted video evidence seen by millions of people. Now he gave the Department of Justice a soundbite they could play in court. He turned a local arrest into a national scandal, and he handed federal prosecutors exactly what they needed to prove not just misconduct, but institutional protection of misconduct. Gordon Hale didn't just defend the arrest. He sealed his own career in 11 minutes of primetime confidence. 48 hours after Darius Okafor was booked into the 3rd Precinct, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division formally opened an investigation. Not a review, not an inquiry, an investigation. The kind with subpoena power and federal authority, and the ability to pull files that local departments like to pretend don't exist. Federal agent Marcus Lowe walked into the 3rd Precinct at 9:15 a.m. on Friday morning with a document case and a list of exactly what he needed. He didn't ask permission. He didn't schedule a meeting. He presented his credentials to the desk sergeant and requested immediate access to personnel files, incident reports, internal affairs records, and all body cam footage related to case number 2025-04-8841. The sergeant made a phone call. 10 minutes later, a lieutenant appeared and escorted Agent Lowe to a conference room where everything he'd requested was already being compiled by 2 very nervous records clerks. Agent Lowe started with Officer Vince Drayton's personnel file. It was thick. 22 years of service generates a lot of paper. Commendations, training certifications, performance reviews, and complaints. 17 of them, spanning 8 years. Agent Lowe read through each one methodically, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook that he filled in the same neat handwriting he'd been using since law school. Excessive force, 12 complaints, 9 from black civilians, unlawful search, 2 complaints, verbal abuse, 3 complaints. Every single one of them marked the same way at the bottom of the investigation summary: unfounded, exonerated, not sustained. 17 complaints, 0 discipline, 0 retraining, 0 consequences. Agent Lowe made a note, moved to the next file. Sergeant Roy Kettner's approval signature on the arrest report was time-stamped 3:47 p.m. on Wednesday, April 17th. Agent Lowe cross-referenced that with the booking log. Darius Okafor's personal property had been logged at 3:22 p.m. 25 minutes before Kettner signed off, which meant Kettner had access to the full intake sheet, including the notation that read, "Personal property, military dog tag, U.S. Navy," before he approved the charges. Agent Lowe made another note, moved to the next file. Conrad Spear's internal affairs report on the military complaint was 4 pages long. Agent Lowe read it twice. The conclusion was clear: insufficient evidence to substantiate claim of wrongful detention. The report was filed at 5:52 p.m. on Wednesday, 4 hours after the complaint was submitted. 4 hours to review a case involving a military service member detained during a classified federal meeting. Agent Lowe pulled the original complaint that Commander Solarin had submitted to the DOJ, 47 pages. Service record, deployment history, meeting confirmation from Naval Intelligence, timestamps, documentation. Everything Spear claimed wasn't there. Agent Lowe didn't make a note this time. He just stared at the screen for a long moment, then forwarded both files, Spear's report and Solarin's original complaint, to his supervisor with a subject line that read, "Deliberate suppression. Recommend criminal referral." Then he pulled the body cam footage. All 3 cameras, Vince Drayton's, Cody Fisk's, Paul Retner's. He watched them in sequence, then side by side, then frame by frame against Paul Retner's written incident report. The report said Darius became verbally aggressive. The body cam showed him speaking in a calm, measured tone. The report said he made furtive movements toward his waistband. The body cam showed him reaching slowly toward his pocket, while announcing exactly what he was doing. The report said he resisted physical restraint. The body cam showed him face down on concrete, cuffed, not moving, while Vince Drayton yelled, "Stop resisting," at a man who wasn't. 14 contradictions. Agent Lowe counted them, documented each one, time-stamped the footage against the written narrative. Then he pulled up the recording of Chief Gordon Hale's press conference from Wednesday night, played it on his laptop. Listen to Hale say the words. The officers involved acted appropriately, professionally, and in full accordance with departmental guidelines. We stand behind them completely. Agent Lowe stopped the video, opened a new window, played the bystander footage next to it. Split screen, Hale's voice on one side, Darius on the ground on the other. He forwarded both to his supervisor. Subject line, Public Institutional Defense contradicted by evidence. Recommend inclusion in final report. At 2:37 p.m., the mayor of the city received a phone call from a federal prosecutor informing her that the DOJ had opened a formal civil rights investigation into the arrest of a Navy service member and was currently reviewing evidence that suggested a pattern of excessive force, deliberate suppression of complaints, and institutional protection of misconduct. Site at 4 p.m., the mayor called an emergency city council session. At 4:45 p.m., 16 city council members sat in a closed session and watched the body cam footage, read the federal summary, and listen to the prosecutor explain, in language that left no room for misunderstanding, that this was no longer a local issue. This was federal, this was documented, and this was going to result in consequences that the city could either cooperate with or fight in a courtroom they would lose. Nobody in that room defended the arrest. Nobody defended the officers. Nobody even tried to defend Chief Hale's press conference, which was now being cited in the federal complaint as evidence of deliberate institutional misinformation. The cover-up wasn't just worse than the crime. It was worse in a way that could be proven, time-stamped, and submitted as evidence in a federal case. Vince Drayton's 17 complaints, Kettner's signature after the dog tag was logged, Spears' 4-hour burial of a 47-page military complaint, Hale's televised defense that contradicted 4 different camera angles, 6 people, 6 documented decisions, 6 names in a federal evidence folder that was growing thicker by the hour, and every single one of them had made the same miscalculation. They thought the system would protect them the way it always had. They didn't realize the system had just run into something bigger. The interviews were conducted on the same day in different rooms at the federal building downtown. Not the 3rd Precinct, not City Hall, federal territory, neutral ground that stopped being neutral the moment each person walked through the door and saw 2 DOJ investigators sitting across a table with folders that had their names on them. Same questions, same evidence, different answers, all of them wrong. Vince Drayton came in first, 9 a.m. He sat down with the posture of a man who'd been through internal reviews before and survived all of them. Confident, arms crossed initially, then uncrossed when Agent Lowe slid the first photograph across the table. A still frame from the body cam showing Darius sitting on the steps, hands on his knees, phone in one hand, not moving. "But can you describe the subject's behavior when you first approached?" Agent Lowe asked. Vince leaned forward slightly. He was agitated, defensive. His body language was aggressive. Aggressive how? Posture, tone, the way he was sitting. You develop an instinct for these things. Agent Lowe didn't respond. He just played the body cam footage. Volume up. Darius's voice came through the speakers, calm and measured. "I have a meeting, 2 o'clock, 9th floor. I can call him if you need verification." Vince watched the screen. His jaw tightened. "That doesn't sound aggressive to me, Officer Drayton. Does it sound aggressive to you?" Vince said nothing. Cody Fisk came in at 10:30 a.m. younger, nervous. He sat with his hands in his lap and answered every question like he was trying to find the right answer instead of the true one. Why didn't you intervene when Officer Drayton took the subject to the ground?" Fisk hesitated. "I was following Drayton's lead. He's senior. I assumed he had cause." "Did you see the subject resist?" Fisk stopped, started again. "Drayton said he was resisting." "I didn't ask what Drayton said. I asked what you saw." Fisk looked at the table. "I didn't see him resist." That was the first crack. Agent Lowe wrote it down, underlined it. Fisk had just contradicted the arrest report that all 3 officers had signed off on. Paul Rettner came in at 12:15 p.m., right after lunch. He'd had time to think, time to prepare, time to realize that this wasn't a formality. Agent Lowe opened his laptop and pulled up Rettner's incident report on one side of the screen and the body cam footage on the other. You wrote that the subject became verbally aggressive. Can you point to the moment in this footage where that happened?" Retner watched the video. It's not always captured on camera, it's the tone. The tone. Agent Lowe scrolled through the report. You also wrote that the subject made furtive movements toward his waistband. I'm going to play that section now. The footage showed Darius reaching slowly toward his pocket, saying clearly, "I'm reaching for my phone." That's your furtive movement? Retner shifted in his seat. In the moment, it looked different. Agent Lowe pulled out a printed document. Your report contradicts the body cam footage on 14 separate points. 14. Would you like to revise your statement? Retner said he wanted a lawyer. Roy Kettner came in at 2 p.m., 22 years on the force. He'd signed off on hundreds of arrest reports. This was just one more. That's what he thought walking in. Agent Lowe opened the booking log on his laptop, turned it so Kettner could see. This entry shows that the subject's personal property was logged at 3:22 p.m. It specifically notes, military dog tag, U.S. Navy. You signed the approval at 3:47 p.m., 25 minutes later. Did you review the intake sheet before signing? I review everything. So you saw the notation about the dog tag? Kettner paused. I don't recall specifically seeing that. Agent Lowe slid a printed copy of the booking sheet across the table. The dog tag notation was circled in red. It's right here, Sergeant. Third line. You're telling me you reviewed this document and didn't see this line? I process a lot of paperwork. Did you see it or not? Kettner looked at the paper, at the circle, at his own signature at the bottom. I may have missed it. Agent Lowe made a note. The booking log proved Kettner was lying, or incompetent. Either way, his signature was on a document approving charges against a military service member whose military status was documented right in front of him. Conrad Speer came in at 3:30 p.m. Internal Affairs, the man whose job was to investigate complaints. Agent Lowe handed him a printed copy of his own report. 4 pages. Insufficient evidence. You concluded that the military complaint lacked documentation. Is that correct? That's what I found. Agent Lowe opened a folder. Ito pulled out a printed copy of Commander Sullivan's original submission to the DOJ, 47 pages, service record, deployment history, meeting confirmation, timestamps, documentation. He set it on the table between them. This is what Commander Sullivan submitted, 47 pages of documentation, and you wrote that it lacked documentation. Can you explain that? Speer stared at the stack. I didn't receive that. I received a summary through the departmental system. A summary of this. Agent Lowe tapped the folder. And you marked it insufficient without requesting the full file? Speer said nothing. Chief Gordon Hale came in last. 5 p.m. Still in uniform. Still projecting authority. Agent Lowe played the press conference recording. Hale's voice filled the room. The officers involved acted appropriately, professionally, and in full accordance with departmental guidelines. Then Agent Lowe played the body cam footage, side by side. Chief Hale, when you made this statement, had you reviewed the body cam footage? I relied on departmental reporting. The same reporting that contradicts the footage we're watching right now? Hale's jaw tightened. I stand by my statement. Agent Lowe closed his laptop. Your statement is now evidence in a federal investigation, and it directly contradicts video documentation viewed by 4 million people. Do you understand what that means? Hale understood. 6 people, 6 interviews, 6 stories that collapsed the moment the federal agents opened the evidence folder. Not one of them had an answer that held up. Not one of them had a defense that survived contact with documentation, timestamps, and video proof. And every word they'd just said was now part of the federal record. The DOJ released its findings on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the arrest. The report was 89 pages long, detailed, methodical, devastating. It concluded that federal civil rights violations had occurred at multiple levels: initial contact, use of force, arrest procedure, supervisory approval, internal investigation, and public institutional defense. 6 names appeared in the findings, 6 separate violations, 6 separate recommendations for termination and criminal referral where applicable. The findings went public at 10 a.m. By noon, the city had acted. Officer Vince Drayton was terminated effective immediately. 22 years of service ended with a single-page letter delivered by courier to his home address. The letter cited excessive force, false arrest, and violation of civil rights under color of authority. Attached to the termination was a criminal referral to the county prosecutor's office recommending charges of assault and filing a false police report. Both felonies. Vince's attorney would later negotiate a plea that kept him out of prison, but put him on a registry that meant he'd never work in law enforcement again. Not in this state. Not in any state. Officer Cody Fisk was terminated the same day. Failure to intervene. Failure to report excessive force. 9 years on the force. No criminal referral. The DOJ determined his actions were passive rather than active. But passive complicity still ended his career. He'd stood 3 feet away and watched a man get slammed face first into concrete for no reason. And he'd done nothing. That silence cost him everything. Officer Paul Rettner was terminated and criminally charged. Falsifying an official police report. A felony in this state. The body cam footage contradicted his written narrative on 14 documented points. 14 lies. 14 pieces of evidence a jury could count. Rettner would plead guilty 8 months later to avoid trial. The plea came with probation, a permanent criminal record, and the kind of reputation that follows you into every job interview for the rest of your life. Sergeant Roy Kettner was terminated for dereliction of duty and falsifying approval records. He'd signed his name to an arrest report 25 minutes after a booking log documented that the suspect was a military service member. The DOJ report included a screenshot of that booking sheet with Kettner's signature right below the words "Military Dog Tag, U.S. Navy." He claimed he didn't see it. The federal investigators determined that was either a lie or incompetence. Either way, 22 years of service ended with a termination letter and a pension review that would take 18 months and reduce his retirement benefits by 40%. Internal Affairs Officer Conrad Speer was terminated for obstruction of a federal military complaint. He'd marked a 47-page documented submission as insufficient evidence and closed the case in 4 hours. The DOJ report called it deliberate suppression. Speer would later claim he'd only seen a summary. The investigators didn't care. His job was to investigate complaints, not bury them. 11 years of internal affairs work ended with a termination and a referral to the state licensing board that revoked his law enforcement certification permanently. EO Chief Gordon Hale didn't wait to be fired. He resigned at 4:47 p.m. on Tuesday, 3 hours after the DOJ findings were released. The resignation letter was 2 sentences long. No explanation, no apology. Just a statement that he was stepping down effective immediately. The city council accepted it without comment. His pension, 28 years of contributions, was placed under federal review, pending the outcome of the DOJ investigation into whether his press conference constituted deliberate institutional misinformation. That review would take 2 years. Hale would never speak publicly about the case again. The DOJ consent decree came down the following week. The 3rd Precinct was placed under federal monitoring for a minimum of 3 years. Mandatory reforms, use of force retraining, bias training, new complaint procedures, independent oversight, the kind of federal supervision that turns a police department into a laboratory for institutional accountability. On a Thursday morning 2 weeks later, the mayor stood on the steps of the Hargrove Federal Building, the same steps where Darius Okafor had been taken down, and issued a formal public apology. Cameras everywhere, reporters, microphones. The same podium energy that Chief Hale had used to defend the arrest, now being used to apologize for it. Darius Okafor didn't attend. He'd been invited. Declined politely. He was already back at work. 300 miles away in Virginia, Commander Nkechi Solarin sat at her desk with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She read the final summary from the DOJ, 6 terminations, federal monitoring, public apology, case resolved. She closed the file. You picked up a stamp and pressed it onto the cover page. The ink read, "Closed, resolved in favor of service member." She moved the file to a stack on the left side of her desk. Completed cases. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. This was just procedure. This was what happened when the military took care of its own. Quietly, methodically, completely. She picked up the next file, opened it, started reading. Somewhere in that 3rd Precinct evidence locker, A clear plastic bag sat on a shelf with a label that read, "Personal Property, Military Dog Tag, U.S. Navy." Vince Drayton had seen a man in a gray t-shirt who didn't belong. What he missed, what all 6 of them missed, was the dog tag, 6 inches from his face, the whole time. That single piece of stamped metal didn't just identify Darius Okafor. It identified the chain of command that would dismantle 6 careers in less than a month, and none of them saw it coming. This is what happens when documentation meets accountability. When one phone call to the right person dismantles an entire system that thought it was untouchable. If this story reminded you that justice isn't loud, it's procedural, precise, and permanent, then don't let it stop here. Hit like, share this with someone who needs to see how real accountability works, and subscribe, because we tell these stories every week. The ones where the system tried to win and lost. The ones that don't make the front page, but should. The cover-up is always worse than the crime, and we document both. Don't look away.